Everybody hear me and see that?
Yep.
Just briefly a history of my freelance model railroad and how it kind of came to be, how I decided to do my own thing. All started back in 1972. We were on a family vacation in San Francisco. My mom and my little sister decided they wanted to go see the Wax Museum down on Fisherman's Wharf. And Dad and I were kind of cold on that. We thought, we'll just kind of walk around. To this day, I've never found anybody that could tell me what this was or where it was, but it was somewhere in that area. We walked around the corner and there was this giant admission, I think it was $2 to get in or something, train layout. And I can't even remember if it was American Flyer or Lionel, but it was one of the two. And it had like 7 or 8 trains flying around at once. And it was just spectacular. And we spent an hour and a half, 2 hours in there. And after that, I was kind of had the train bug. And then when we moved my mom out of her home this past fall, I had a scrapbook evidently that I had as a kid. And this was the clipping I took out of the Sears Roebuck catalog that year and asked for Santa for Christmas. And that's the exact set I got. But anyway, so it was Santa Fe all the way, at least for a few years after that. I collected Santa Fe stuff. And this was a photo. This is the only photos I could find of my second layout that was actually above my dad's garage. It's kind of the track plan you can see up there, wired for DC, of course, in those days. First layout was just a 4x8 that folded into the wall of the garage. All those pine trees you see are the old bottle brush between the twisted wire with the rope cut into pieces, and we made hundreds of those, and I still have all those incidentally, and you'll see them on some of the other layouts as kind of background trees. They just need a little freshening up, and they're good for that. And you'll probably see them on a future layout too. But other than that, my influences, of course, going right downtown, we had Burlington Northern, was former Great Northern, of course, the Freight of Washington, where I grew up. And the thing that was kind of cool about that is the only real industry in town at that time was the grain elevators, like everywhere in Eastern Washington. And then, of course, I believe there was a bulk oil distributor in town and a propane dealer. But for the most part, these trains would fly through town. It was a nice, long, straight run, 60 miles an hour. They'd blast through the middle of town. And so that was my rail fanning. That's kind of where I got hooked on the Burlington Northern. This particular two pictures was in the summer of 78. I don't know exactly what month it was, but all I know is there's some kind of a derailment west of Ephrata at Winchester. And so trains were stacking up there in Ephrata, and there's the crew there on the left-hand picture letting us climb along around the locomotives and everything. And it was about 3 hours of total heaven for me at the time. And then when I went to graduated high school, went to college up in Bellingham, got really familiar with the Milwaukee Road and started taking an interest in the Milwaukee Road. They had a Bellingham-based EMD switcher down there on Railroad Avenue at the time that was always parked there. So I was able to get some pictures of that. And then my uncle and aunt lived up in Sumas on Frost Road. There was the limestone quarry was up there, and they called it the Rock Train, and it boarded their property. And so about 2 or 3 times a week, this rock train would go up there, and whenever we visited it, I'd go up and visit my aunt and uncle. I'd always make sure and try to time it with the rock train so I get to see that. And a couple times we actually hiked the line all the way down into Sumas, and it was beautiful because it followed this creek, and there was 13, 14 trestles along the way. And of course, that's long since gone. So I kind of had a little bit of interest in the Milwaukee Road too. And so when deciding to model, I was kind of going from Burlington Northern to, do I want to do the Milwaukee Road? And I thought, well, I should do, what I grew up with in Eastern Washington, do the Burlington Northern. But problem is I liked trees and mountains, and I liked industry and stuff. And I had a hard time justifying what I would model. Eastern Washington, of course, is a lot of farmland. Part that upper Wenatchee through the coulees, this gigantic, it's amazing how big it really is until you see it. The basalt cliffs, that area, and didn't really have the room to do that. And so of course you wanted to do the double bridge at Rock Island shown here, and you wanted to do maybe the Trinidad Loop, all that stuff. It was one of these things where, what do I want to selectively compress and what do I want to leave out? And my magazine started seeing all these really cool freelance layouts, Virginia and Ohio, and Tony Custer's Allegheny Midland, and Eric Bruman's Utah Belt, and thought, well, that'd be kind of cool. I can do my own paint scheme, put the bridges where I want, put the rivers where I want. Track plan doesn't have to follow anything. I don't even have to do all the research to do a prototype. So that's kind of how the decision to freelance came about. The next spot was, okay, where do I want to make this freelance railroad at? And of course, living in Washington all my life, I decided I kind of wanted to do Washington, but I also wanted to pick a spot that would kind of fit in with the map of the real railroads to kind of justify why a railroad would be there. And The only place I could find that really didn't have any serious railroad traffic was Olympic Peninsula after the Milwaukee Road quit up to Port Angeles, and then Seattle North Coast gave it up. There was a big section of upper Pacific Northwest that didn't have any rail traffic, and of course there was a reason. There wasn't much industry up there anymore. So I kind of did a little research on the history of the railroads up there. And of course, when the first Northern Transcon was being built, a lot of people on the Olympic Peninsula, even along the little towns along Hood Canal, were kind of thinking, hey, this is our chance, to get on the map. The western terminus is going to come out here. And of course, we all know that became Tacoma. In my theory, this is a lot of words, but anyway, World War I, there was a lot of spruce for the development of aircraft for World War I, and it pushed the line that was that went up to Port Angeles to expand all the way past Lake Crescent and go eventually to Forks. And when they finally finished driving the last spike, which was about 1918, I guess November 30th, it was just a few days after the war had ended. So suddenly the spruce wasn't quite as in demand, and the Army Corps of Engineers wasn't, building anymore. Anyway, the line was extended to Forks. There was a lot of logging lines that branched out from around the area, but due to the lack of revenue and lawsuits stemming from the Great Forks Fire of 1951, competition to logging traffic, most of the railroads were torn up, abandoned, and that's kind of where it is now. Here's just a couple examples of some of the logging lines that were up there. And this is from the Forks Timber Museum, another up in Clallam, another logging picture. And this is a map. It's hard to read this, but the main line, I don't know if can you guys see my mouse as I move it?
Yep.
Okay, this was the actual, the main line that went down into Forks, and all these others were the logging lines coming out of there. So I said, well, what if this line was still there and still serviceable, and maybe there was still a lot of lumber in the Forks area coming out, and maybe to try to justify traffic. I decided that to justify any major traffic, I'd have to kind of invent a city. So I chose Discovery Bay up by Port Townsend, kind of fantasized, well, what if this was a deep water port? What if there was a big city around it? It would be, right there on the Strait of Juan de Fuca, big shipping, a good place to have a shipping terminus for overseas traffic and stuff. So I kind of drew a map. The right-hand part of the loop from Port Townsend down to Olympia, I've kind of, at this stage, kind of abandoned, forgot about. So I determined my main line was going to go from the major city deep water port of Port Andrews up there in Discovery Bay, down around to Forks and on down to past Hoquiam, Aberdeen, down to Longview, and eventually maybe into Portland to interchange. And I decided to model the current era, which at that time was 1995. I kind of liked Eric Bruman's approach that he would keep updating his locomotive roster, and as time went on, but I soon decided that was not a financially good decision to do. So the early paint scheme was kind of Burlington Northern, kind of kept that in the back of my mind. I changed kind of the black on top to gray, and I kind of like the yellow as opposed to the white. Turned out looking a lot like the Katy. So I eventually lost the chevron stripes on the hood unit and kind of went to this kind of a paint scheme as my final. The first version that I know none of you have seen was a double-decked layout above a double garage in my old home. Started in February of 95, as I said. Bench work was robust, but kind of simple, kind of chunky. Nothing fancy, no spline or anything like that. It was mostly all 1x4s and 2x4s and 3/4 inch plywood. It was basically a big U, a couple peninsulas that had, on both sides, and going to be a double decker. It's going to be a helix originally. Here's some more of it. The bright picture on the right is kind of the turnaround on the one leg of the U that matches the right side of the picture on the left, to give you a little bit better idea of what you're looking at here. But basically framed it all out, and then I decided I was going to try to finish the top level before I dripped scenery all over the bottom level. So after I had the track all laid out, the main line anyway, I started to do the upper level. Landforms back then, I still kind of actually like it. It's quick and easy. I just did the landforms by a rough cutting wood, scraps of wood, plywood, using a metal screen, and then just doing the old, plaster of Paris over paper towel kind of hard shell scenery. That's how I did almost all of this layout. It worked out pretty well. The wiring is something I would paid a little bit more attention to. This is my first dive into DCC. I wish I would have paid a little bit more attention to the quality of the wiring before I started the scenery on there. Finish the upper level first and then do the bottom level. Kind of worked pretty well. Here's another section on the other side. You'll notice the difference between the left and right pictures on the bottom. I decided to have staging on a third level, and you can see some of the staging started on the right-hand picture, and I elevated slightly the lower deck on this side of the picture to be able to do that. A traditional helix, I didn't like the fact that it was going to be, you know, invisible. Your train disappears for long periods of time, so I kind of did a visible helix. This is the construction of it here on the left, and then what it kind of started to look like. I never got to the finished stage of this before that layout was torn down, but that's kind of what it ended up being, is kind of lopsided loops on top of each other, which allowed to do some scenery and some bridges, and instead of just having a train disappear for 2 or 3 minutes as it climbed the helix. Here's a picture of kind of the finish right before it got torn down, upper and lower. You'll notice the grotesque difference in lighting between the top and the bottom. The top was fluorescent, and of course the bottom was incandescent. It didn't make a big difference if you were photographing one or the other, but when you got a shot like this, it's shocking how much different that the lighting made. Kind of a brief tour here. I developed a scenario where the CP would come across from either the mainland or Vancouver Island and drop off at a Carfloat and interchange with the Washington Northern somewhere up along the Strait of Juan de Fuca there. And this was the junction with an abandoned tower, been taken out of service. And this tower will follow me through the next layout and probably will be on the future layout as well. This is the Spring Creek Falls. There's a section again on the upper level. Once again, these are all those same bottle brush treetops that I had made back as a kid. And the only thing I did on a lot of these is add some dowels for trunks to get them up in the air a little bit, make them look a little bit more like some of the trees you see in the Pacific Northwest rather than Christmas trees. Bridge over the Hoh River, double tracked at this point. I got frustrated because this is one of the Walther's original double track bridges that when you tried to run a double stack train through it, it wouldn't fit. It would hit the top of it. So that was kind of a bugaboo, but some more of the upper level. The background was a combination of photographic and painted clouds. They were 11-17 sheets butted together, and of course you saw the seams, but you know, if you in photography you could hide them pretty well. This was the mine, coal mine. Every railroad has to have a coal mine at what I call the town of recharge, or the location of recharge. There's several of Walther's kits that were kit bashed and put together. Another view of it. Continuing on the upper loop, this was the town of Glacier, just a little hamlet somewhere in the mountains. Had a little farmer's supply or brancher's supply store and a team track out there just for a little bit of extra switching along the main line. Here's another view of the same town with a little station. You'll probably all recognize the classic Atlas station there on the right. And then as we get down to the lower level, this is in Port Andrews. This is, you know, the industrial area and where most of the switching would take place. The track that you see in the foreground on the lower right is what actually led down to staging. So what I did is I developed a scenario where all the in-town industries, such as, you know, your factories and stuff like that, would be switched, but stuff like the stack trains and the grain trains and everything that would be going to a port that wasn't modeled would head down here, which would actually be into staging. I called it the snake hole. And here's a view of it as it goes down and kind of disappears there. Not sure what I was thinking about this bridge here. Well, I do know what I was thinking. I was going to do an elevated type of a bridge across there, and then I just ended up setting another truss bridge on top of it. The classification yard at Port Andrews Discovery Yard. This is the paper mill that was along it, and this is where all the trains that didn't go into staging to the fantasy port industries would come and stop, and then be broken up into switching jobs for the rest of Port Andrews. This is a shot of the waste treatment plant that I was building out of scraps and parts for the paper mill. Never got completely finished, and here was going to be the future diesel facility. Those are some of the pictures I had of that layout, which was dismantled in 2004. So it was up about 9 years. Made pretty good progress on it. And then my next layout was the one that many of you have seen, Port Andrews Tideflats district layout. I think it was 10.5 by 11.5 spare bedroom. this was the track plan as I started it. I was only given access to about half of the room. So I was just going to do a switching layout. And I should mention that one of the reasons I kind of got out of modeling a little bit is this was in a brand new house. It really didn't have room for a layout. And at the time I'd kind of got into saltwater reef aquarium hobby too. And so that took up a lot of my time and a lot of my budget. And this kind of came after I had that all set up, something to do, as I was still interested in trains, of course. But this layout was taken from Callenbach's model railroader, 1998. I don't know the exact month it was, but it was the Pike City Beltline. And what I did is I flipped it to better fit the room for where the door was in the closets. Basically just a switching shelf layout. It had a little bit of staging there in the upper right behind the 3-story building that they had. So this is how I adapted it to my room. I changed it a little bit. I wanted the paper mill in the back. The shaded area is what would come in the future. Part that's not shaded was what I had originally, with the exception of the paper mill was configured a little bit different. And you'll see that in some pictures coming up. The construction of it was basically just shelf brackets. Worked pretty well. I had to do some shimming. It as sturdy as those brackets were, it did kind of tend to sag in the front. And just basically 1x4s, 1x6s, or whatever I had to fit the thing. And 3/4-inch plywood. There was basically no elevation gain on this railroad at all. So that simplified grading and all that kind of stuff. You can see on the left picture, I had intended to have a Carfloat for some interchange. This is the original paper mill configuration, which was against the wall in the corner, which would have been the upper left on that track plan that you saw. And the staging was actually inside these buildings behind these. I kind of did the paper mill in a modular type thing that I would carry on to the future version too. So if anything came off the track or anything there, you could just lift off the different sections of buildings and get to the staging yard in the back. And it only had about, I think it was two cars, or 2 tracks of about 4 cars each, maybe eight cars for staging. And that paper mill had 1 chemical track. You could bring in some wood chip cars. You could bring in, box cars for loading, and some chemical additive tracks for the paper mill. And this shows where the staging went in with part of the mill removed. In the background there, you can see the tracks that go underneath the building for staging. And it worked pretty well. The layout, only could handle about 10 to 12 cars on the, places for spotting cars on the layout at one time. So that staging was actually adequate at the time. There's a kind of an overview of the original configuration. You had the chemical track down here at the bottom, and a little bit of a switching pull-out lead. And then you had 2 tracks went down the middle of the mill, and then staging underneath the back. Construction was basically hydrocal over screen, like I did with the layout before that you'd seen. The only thing I did on this with the hydrocal, I mixed some vermiculite, which there was an article in Model Railroad Hobbyist that said it caused it to dry a little bit slower, and also it didn't set quite as hard, and it actually was easier to poke holes in with your awl for planting trees and stuff. And so I decided to try it. And then here's that scene nearing completion with your cast resin water. And the trees at this point are not those bottle brush. They're the tree trunks are from Coastman's Sceniced. They're actual, I think they're redwood. Maybe not redwood. I don't know what he uses, but anyway, they come and you pre-drill the holes, and then you put the little branches in. And they have foliage kits too, but I use furnace filter for my foliage. But the trunks they look really good in my opinion when they're up close. And then the other trees were either super trees or they were sagebrush armatures. I collected whenever I went and visited my folks in Eastern Washington in the wintertime. I just clip a bunch of sagebrush over there and then stretch it with polyfiber and ground foam. And this is the waterfront area that I wanted to include and reemphasize the port theme of it all. Olympic copper and pipe. This is on one side. There's a centered backdrop. I don't know if you noticed that on the track plan, but there was a center backdrop. The leg of the T basically on that track plan was divided into 2 halves by this center backdrop. All the scenery on here was basically all the major buildings were building flats. Here it is nearing completion. Scenery and the water and everything. It's kind of a little fun little area to switch. Another view of it. The Sea Dog Boats and Marine Supply was a scratch-built structure. It's actually a freight station that was in Model Railroad Craftsman, the plans for that years and years ago. Boat supply store. Another version of it there. Attempt at kind of a night evening type scene. Here's the switcher coming down between the Sea Dog and the scrap dealer. one of the things that I kind of wanted to avoid was just being a switching layout. You have to have, a lot of track, but I didn't want it to be just track spaghetti, from the layout, from the edge of the layout. So I decided to put the tracks that went to the pier scenes kind of behind the town instead of running in front of it, just to add some visual interest. And this was kind of the last section I did on the original part of the layout. I struggled with how to position the town and the buildings in a way that was appealing. It was a struggle, but I finally came up with something I thought worked pretty well. The buildings are, all kit and kit bashed type buildings. The asphalt is actually illustration board. I found that it worked pretty well. I just put illustration board down and then painted it and weathered it and drew in the cracks. And if you wanted potholes, you could actually gouge it a little bit and then paint over the gouges and stuff. And it ended up doing a pretty good job. Just another scene of the big city. I was kind of inspired at this point by Vic Smith's The City's Edge layout. If you've ever seen that layout, he has videos and he's been in the magazines too, and outstanding modeler. Another part of the city scene there. And part of my solution was to kind of angle the street in there a little bit to get some more interesting angles instead of have everything be square and boxy looking. And I think it worked pretty well. And there's kind of an overall view of the city area that you saw at that part of the layout, and placed the track secondary at this point and concentrated on scenery to try to not overwhelm you with track. Incidentally, my DCC system was NCE at this point. The first layout that I showed you, I initially started with lens, and then I started operating on a couple layouts that had NCE, and I really liked that system, so I switched this layout to NCE. Some more pictures of around the town area. This is a scrap dealer. I think the width of the actual dealership there is maybe 3 inches. The background's all photos that I stitched together in Photoshop and blended in as carefully as I could with the foreground scenery. And the graffitied foreground fence was actually just printed and then put on a styrene back and kind of bent the corners a little bit to with the scrap look. This is one of the few craftsman kits I had on there. I really like building craftsman kits. My problem is modeling a newer type era. I often find that so many of the craftsman kits are turn of the century or at the latest transition era kits, and it's kind of hard to justify those kind of old wooden buildings anymore on a modern layout. So this is one of the Bar Mills kits. I forget the name of the actual kit, but I just turned it into a little bayside seafood place that kind of, if you're around Tacoma or any other area around here, you see these little places that sell seafood. And Blue Star Ready Mix, another building flat kit bash from Walters Kits and scratch built pieces, just for another industry to switch. This is going over to the only other industry that was on the short leg of the T is Elk Creek hardwoods. They had a little spur that was serviced over there. And then Union Tower was there's that same tower that you saw in the other layout up on the upper level. This is that classic Atlas kit that I wanted to make it look abandoned and forlorn and probably nearing tear down stage. Another view of it here. This train's coming in to switch to the other side of the Middle Peninsula. And then there's just some abandoned warehouses, or at least old warehouses that are back flats on the other side. That the opposite side of this would have been the cement plant and the Olympic Copper and Pipe. And then further on down, I had a Peninsula cold storage and a seafood distributor to switch. And this is just a picture of my my chemical spray train that I built. And I actually have no idea how all these pipes that are under there work. I just found pictures and matched what I saw. And then came the expansion, and when my wife gave me a generous land grant for the rest of the room, she had her treadmill in there at first, and then she moved that out of there and I got the rest of the room. So my mill expanded quite a bit after that, and I rearranged some stuff, and my staging became what's underneath all these buildings now. It expanded my staging to 2 tracks of 9 capacity and 10 capacity. So now I had about 20, almost 20 cars that I could stage back there. And then there's the left half of it. So the staging went actually underneath the wood chip pile, and then all on the back in there, it's a double track. And you see back here on the track plan, it'll show you that. This drawing was done when the layout was featured in 2015 Great Model Railroads by Kalmbach. I sent them a sketch of the track plan, and they drew it, and they actually never got back to me to have me check it over before they published it. And they did a really good job. It's very accurate, with the exception of they got an extra lift bridge. I had a lift gate, which you'll see here in a minute, at the corner of the room down there when I expanded on, and somehow they got the idea that there was a lift bridge there as well, which there was not. Other than that, that's a pretty accurate drawing of the track plan. Here's that lift bridge. I had a problem in past. I've always kind of hated duck unders and lift bridges. I just think that they're kind of cumbersome, and there's kind of in the way, but I really didn't have a choice outside of tearing the whole layout down and redesigning it so it'd be a walk-in entry. So I decided to do a lift bridge, and to complicate it, it was on a curve right by the door. So my solution was to kind of overbuild it, make it sturdy so it wasn't going to flex and cause problems. And I used a piano hinge, which is actually behind that whole wooden fence there. That's just a Central Valley plastic wooden fence that, I weathered up to look like wood, and it hid that piano hinge, which is actually on top of the layout quite nicely. You'd have to about put your forehead on the wall to see it. And then I decided I wanted, completely seen it to make it look like it was part of the layout. And there it is when it's up in the air. You can see it's chunked together with the lumber I had, and it was heavy, a little scary to lift up. So I decided I had to do something to make it stay there once I lifted it up. My solution was you see the black cylinder there underneath. It was a screen door cylinder. That you could press that little metal tab up, and it would hold it up in place when it was up, so it wouldn't hopefully fall down on your head. And a few pieces of pipe insulation I have there is just from me trying to cheat and duck under it a few times, and ended up scraping half the skin off my back on a few times before I decided to do that, just for a little bit of safety. And then after you turn the corner, there is what I call Wolf River Junction. It was just a little track heading off to your right. Went over on a branch line that had served industries, and went up to some lumber mills or whatever in the past, but now it had been truncated to serve just a couple industries just across the junction. And then, of course, the train coming over the arch bridge there that you see that's coming out of the tunnel was the entrance to staging on this end of the layout. Here's another view of the junction. The 2 industries that were on that little spur was this propane dealer, just a single car spot, a little wine tasting, Jody's Vineyards, named after my wife, wine tasting little store in the background there. And then the other was Davis Truss and Lumber, which just is a lumber dealer that received center beams full of lumber and drywall. Also on this peninsula was located Grandpa Sam's, and it turned out to be kind of one of my favorite scenes on the layout, and it really has nothing to do with trains. And there's kind of a cool story behind this building. It was actually built by a modeling friend of mine, Rick Wade in Florida. And if you've ever paid any attention or followed along the model railroad hobbyist forums, especially 7, 8, 9 years ago, Rick was very prominent in there, and he had a railroad, and he still does, called the Richland Railroad, and it was a kind of a proto freelance branch line of the Louisville and Nashville. Well, at the time, I've never met Rick, but we got together talking, and we had a couple little modeling correspondence things. We got together and did some resin cast dumpsters before all these fancy 3D printed ones were out. I built a couple dumpsters out of styrene and sent it to him, and he cast resin castings of them, and turned out pretty nice. But anyway, he was going to move from Georgia, and he had to tear down his layout, moving to Florida to be closer to grandkids and stuff. And he said, "Hey, do you have anything I could build to keep me busy until I get my railroad up?" And I bought this kit because it so reminded me of my grandfather's house in North Dakota. Obviously, this isn't a North Dakota setting, but the house itself looked very similar. This is I forget the name of the company. It's the Ronald Reagan house, his childhood home or something like that. But it looked so similar to what I remember seeing at my grandpa's place. So that's why I bought the kit, and I kind of wanted to have it on the layout someday. And I said, you know what? It's a Craftsman kit. I don't have much experience with it. You can build this. So I sent him the kit, and he built it over the course of, I don't know, 2 or 3, 4 months, and then packaged it up and shipped it to me. And he packaged that thing. The first thing when you open the box, there was an instruction sheet of how to unpack it, and it was the packaging was very well engineered, and about the only thing that was loose was the steps there that you see on the front. They had steps on the back like that had come off, but other than that, it was in perfect shape. And so I incorporated, added a few more details to it, and just kind of made a little kind of country, not really so much a farm scene, but just like a, there's a little barn and the house. Really like this scene, and kind of one of my favorites for sentimental reasons, and also it's kind of neat that somebody else built it. Kind of the focal point of the whole layout was the Raven pulp and paper mill. When I got the land grant, of course, it became a lot larger, a lot more switching. And of course, I just started looking at paper mills from all over the place. And just the main thing that caught my eye was what a hodgepodge of buildings they were. I mean, it was like every other day they'd remodel something, and it wouldn't be the same as the buildings before. So that's kind of what I tried to do with this. This is the rotary dumper that was at the paper mill, received the wood chips from the railroad. Interesting thing about this is I found a kit to actually motorize Walther's rotary dumper, and I installed it, and it actually worked really well. Not that I was ever going to have real live loads, because that would be a mess with sawdust or whatever you wanted to use for wood chips, but it worked real well. I was testing it, put it through about 40, 50 cycles, and it worked good. So then I sceniced it in and kind of glued everything down, and it worked about 4 more times. And then the little plastic gear on the metal shaft started slipping, and it wouldn't go anymore. So I tried super gluing it, and that held for a few more cycles, and then I just gave up. I think the solution would be to find a matching metal gear and probably solder it onto the metal shaft or something, or use weld bond or something. But that was short-lived. It was kind of cool while it worked, but like I said, I wasn't really going to use live loads, so it would have just been kind of a cosmetic type interesting thing. Bigger, wider shot of the wood chip pile, and you can just see a sneak peek on the left side. There's some of the screen, and you can see a locomotive there. It's kind of going into the staging area, and so there's a switch right about there that divided into 2 tracks just on the other side of the tunnel. The wood chip piles were just sawdust that I sifted out, got the big pieces out of my wood shop at home, and glued them onto some foam insulation board shaped mounds. The shop switcher number 14 there, that was a company owned switcher that switches the paper mill. The buildings in the background of the switcher on this picture are actually just photos pasted onto styrene or foam core. I think probably both of those were used here. Kind of the Lance Mindheim articles that you might have seen of how he uses just photographs and pastes them onto buildings. And it actually, you don't have the true relief, but it worked pretty well. I thought I'd try it here, and it was fairly effective. This is just kind of the maze of ridiculous, who knows what they all do, pipes and stuff from the chemical areas of the paper mill. And here was the main building. Never did get completely detailed, but I'd just kind of go and add things as, I'd look at pictures and add things as I went. Then the refueling facility for the shop switcher there, which it also provides another spot for a diesel tank car every once in a while. This was the digester that I started building from scratch. I was actually copying one that was actually in Europe. Just thought it kind of looked cool, and that's about as far as I got before this layout was dismantled. But some more detail. This is, of course, the shipping where the paper boxcars would go in and get their loads, and by the waterfront, which would eventually become the wood chip unloading. This is the wood chip barge I kind of wanted to have a wood chip barge. This was originally the Carfloat that you might have noticed in the original construction photos. I decided I was going to use this for the base of my wood chip barge, so I took it and cut it down into 3 pieces and to shorten it because it was too long to be a wood chip barge. Reinforced it with some styrene, did a lot of sanding, little bunch of parts, and then I built the exterior walls to it. A lot of Seaspan barges were wood at the time, and the more modern ones are metal, so I decided this was going to be a metal one. It's kind of what I patterned it after. And then this is kind of what it looks like after it's getting painted and weathered. Seaspan logo on here. I didn't have any way to make white decals, and I didn't want to send away for a one-time custom decal set. So what I did is I painted the whole barge white. You see it better here. The whole barge was painted white, and then I found the font that Seaspan used for their logo, printed out on a piece of paper, taped it down over painter's tape, and then with an X-Acto blade carefully cut out each letter, and then put the painter's tape on the model, and then sprayed the red, and then peeled off the painter's tape to get the white Seaspan underneath. Worked pretty well. It's tedious. I'm glad I wasn't doing a fleet of them, but turned out pretty well. The load inside is once again just sawdust from my wood shop here at home. Interesting thing about it was the interior of it, the load, the base of the load. So I just didn't have a huge pile of sawdust I tried to glue down. I decided I was going to use foam, but I didn't have any scrap. So I thought, you know what? I have this can of spray foam that they use to fill cracks and stuff. So I decided I'm just going to spray that in there and it'll expand, and then I'll kind of carve it down. So I was out in my garage one night and I was spraying this stuff, and it was in the middle of winter, so it was cold. And I don't know if that had an effect on how fast it was expanding, but it wasn't expanding. So I pumping more and more in there, and finally said, okay, I can see it. It's starting to mount up a little bit, and went in and came out the next morning. And I had an in-scale nuclear mushroom cloud. It was like 4.5 feet tall. It was crazy. So anyway, it was interesting, but I just cut it down and it still worked, after I cut it down. But I got a good chuckle of that when I came out the next morning and saw this giant mushroom cloud of foam. And one interesting thing from the traditional scenery is these rocks are all actually petrified wood. Jeff Knott, the Australian model that passed several years ago, he had that wonderful Lee Creek logging railroad and some other railroads that have been well publicized, and he used real rock for all his rocks. And I thought, well, that would be cool. I mean, you get to avoid casting all the plaster and coloring it and everything. But I could never find any rocks around here that had, the appropriate strata, the scale size strata that you kind of want. Everything was river rock, smooth, or much too big. And then one day I was at home, Dad, I don't know when he'd done it, but he collected a bunch of petrified wood, and he had 4 or 5 little coffee cans of it. And I started looking, and I said, hey, this kind of looks like, scale size strata. So I asked if I could have a can. He gave it to me, and I took it home. And after painting it up and stuff, it worked pretty well. I don't know if I'd do it again because it gets awfully heavy, when you're starting stacking this stuff on there. But I basically painted it with acrylics. Of course, it doesn't soak in like a plaster casting. So I built it up slowly in layers, and then just some white highlighting on it. But anyway, all the rocks on this layout were actually petrified wood. Operations were just car card and waybills. I kind of adapted a 2-cycle waybill because none of my industries, I didn't have any industries on the layout that both shipped and received on the layout. Either stuff came in from the outside world, aka staging, to the layout, or vice versa. So basically, I set up a system with just 2-cycle waybills. When it came onto the layout, the number 1 you see on the waybills there was up, and you'd spot the cars and put it in there. And then if you came back the next operating session or the next train or however it would be, if it was 2, you'd pull it. If it still had 1, you'd leave it like it was not unloaded yet. And it was just a very simple way to do it. And I color coded the car cards for car types. It worked out pretty well. This is a photo of Mike Stepner and Tom Klimowski kind of operating the very last operating session we had before the layout was torn down. Mike's back over there by the Olympic Copper and Pipe, switching the Tideflat Industries, and Tom's got the mill turn here. Is going to take that to the paper mill and switch it out. And it's another view of them working. This is a photo of the kind of a blurry photo, but it's the very last train to leave the layout. The next day I started ripping this thing apart. And this is about 2 days into the rip apart. It was amazing how much junk is in a small layout, but especially wiring and stuff. And this is a couple days later, down to the end. So as far as the future goes, the only part that I was able to save of the last layout, or wanted to save, was the kind of the T section that came out in the room. This is Olympic Copper and Pipe again, but the original structure was just a shallow flat. So what I did is I took that center partition out and saved this 2x5 foot section, and I decided I would build a full building now. So I took 2 more Walthers pier kits and combined them and kit bashed them into this one large kit for switching, and then put another track that goes inside the building. It's basically a custom pipe fitter manufacturer. It has complete interior detail on lighting. I chose not to make the roof removable because there was so much bracing that went into it. I thought I'd probably end up doing more damage than it was worth, but it does completely light up. All these little exterior gooseneck lamps I got from off of eBay from China. They were dirt cheap, and they all lit except for one, I think, out of a 25 pack. Experimented with several different kinds of lighting. I was kind of thinking, well, my next layout I want to have totally lit for night operations, but after doing all this and then buying some of the woodland scenics, lighted things and everything, I just look at how much time and money goes into lighting a whole layout. I'm not sure if I'm going to do that or not. But anyway, here's the future next layout. This is what I've been doing on our property, cutting down trees and clearing land. And hopefully we're going to break ground in August. Originally, the original builder that we had, I had a 23 by 15 room. I don't think I'm going to have quite that large in this one, but that's okay. I'll make do with whatever I have and have fun. So that's where the next layout will be again someday. For more information, these are 3 publications that my last layout was featured in. If you have a 2015 Great Model Railroads issue laying around, it's in there, and I think it's still available from callback should you want to purchase one. But and then the good folks at Trackside Model Railroading, I know they've done a lot of area layouts, filmed a lot of layouts. They have put a DVD out, featured the layout, and then 10 years ago, I think, I guess 2011 years now, I guess the Model Railroad Hobbyist had a little feature article on the layout before it was expanded to the full-size room. Other than that, that's kind of my presentation, the history of everything. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
When I first saw your layout, you already had the lift gate in there. Right? And I had a condo at the time, my wife and I did, and I was trying to figure out how to go around the room. Your lift gate bridge actually gave me the idea that I needed in order to get that done. So I was just going to say thanks again for the inspiration. When I saw the way that yours worked, when it went around the corner and then, you came track straight on one side of it and track straight off on the other, I went, okay, that's right. What I'm looking for, because a lot of lift gates they'll try to go with the angled track onto it. And it's like, no, that really doesn't work well at all.
Thanks. I appreciate that. There's been some very complex lift gates and swing gates and double deck swing gates built on doors that pretty impressive. I just didn't feel like tackling something quite so complex.
Kevin, I'd just like to remark that your scenes are incredibly compact and well detailed. You cram more modeling in most areas than most people do. And it's all well done. And I like particularly how effective these flats are.
Oh, thank you.
Kevin, do you have any videos of the last layout?
I have a couple really poor quality ones on YouTube. If you look up Washington Northern, there's a couple of them. The real good video that is on it is that Trackside Model Railroading.
Okay.
I think they got about 20 minutes of video on that.
Well, the reason I asked is I think that I'm going to stick David Yaddick on you, since he's the new AP guy, and do some work with you. I think you have probably earned electrical and volunteer and an interested in chief dispatcher.
Kevin, a couple of questions on the double deck layout. Deck to deck height, vertical separation.
I'm trying to remember exactly what it was. It's like all double decks. I think the lower deck was a little too low and the upper deck was a little too high. I want to say it's probably 24 inches, but that might be a little bit much. I don't know.
That's close enough for what I'm thinking. Yeah. Also, what's the depth of the upper deck?
It was typically about 16 to 18 inches. Typically tried to make it as narrow as possible. I wanted to have it recessed from the, so I could get better access to the lower level without, bumping your head on the upper level and all that kind of stuff. And I'm excited to start designing, but like I said, right now, I still don't know the exact dimensions, what it's going to be. It's not going to be quite as big as 23 by 15, unfortunately, which, I say unfortunately, but at the same time, it's probably, more realistic, more achievable, get trains up and running sooner, more affordable.
Is it still gonna be Western Washington then?
Yeah, I think it's going to be probably the same type of thing. I think, and I'll try to do double deck. I think, kind of do the mountainous stuff again on top, because I really do want a little bit of mainline running. That's one thing on my last layout I missed, so I'll try to incorporate that in there. We'll see how it goes. But all right, gentlemen, thanks for joining us, and we will see you probably next Saturday at the spring meet, hopefully.
Good night.
Take care, everybody.
Good job, Kevin.
Thank you.